When most people think of the US Navy, they think of massive aircraft carriers patrolling the deep blue oceans, destroyers launching missiles from miles away, or submarines silent beneath the polar ice. That was the Blue Water Navy. It was clean. It was powerful. It was safe. But in Vietnam, there was another Navy. A Navy that didn't operate on the ocean, but in the mud. A Navy where the engagement distances weren't measured in miles, but in feet. We were the Brown Water Navy, the riverine force. Our battlefield was the Mekong Delta, a watery maze covering 15,000 square miles of South Vietnam. It was a world of endless mangrove swamps, narrow canals, and muddy rivers that flowed thick like chocolate milk. The Delta was the rice bowl of Vietnam, but it was also the heart of the Viet Cong insurgency. If you controlled the rivers, you controlled the supplies, the people, and the war. The VC had owned these waterways for 20 years. They moved their weapons on sampans at night. They taxed the local farmers. They set up ambushes on the banks. Our job was to take it back, to kick down the door of their sanctuary and drive a wedge of American steel right up the middle of their territory. I remember arriving at Bin Tui, our base on the Bassac River. The first thing that hit you was the smell. The Delta smelled of rotting vegetation, diesel fumes, burning charcoal, and human waste, all baking under a relentless tropical sun. The heat was different here than in the highlands. It was wet, heavy. It sat on your chest like a physical weight. I was assigned to a PBR, a patrol boat river. The first time I saw a PBR, I thought it was a joke. It didn't look like a warship. It looked like a pleasure craft you'd see on a lake back home on the 4th of July. It was 31 feet long. And here's the kicker. The hull wasn't made of steel armor. It was made of fiberglass. Fiberglass. The same stuff Corvette sports cars are made of. You could punch a hole in it with a solid kick. If an AK-47 round hit it, it didn't just make a hole. It shredded the material, sending razor-sharp glass splinters flying inside the boat, turning the hull itself into shrapnel. We were expected to take these plastic boats into the heart of enemy territory, up narrow canals where the banks were so close you could reach out and touch the palm fronds. But the PBR had teeth. It was designed for one thing: overwhelming, close-range violence. Up in the bow, in an open tub that felt dangerously exposed, was a twin 50 caliber machine gun mount. Those two guns could chop down a tree in seconds. Aft, on the fantail, was another 50 cal. And amidships, we carried an M60 machine gun and a Mark 18 grenade launcher, a hand-cranked beast that could lob explosive rounds like a rapid-fire mortar. 4 men, a boat captain, an engine man, a gunner's mate, and a seaman. We were a tight crew. We had to be. On a 30-foot boat, there are no secrets. You live together, eat together, sweat together, and fight together. Our primary defense wasn't armor, it was speed. The PBR was powered by 2 massive diesel engines driving water jets, jacuzzis on steroids. No propellers to get snagged in nets or weeds. We could go from 0 to 30 knots in seconds. We could turn on a dime. We could stop almost instantly by reversing the jets, throwing a wall of water over the bow. We were fast, we were loud, and we were totally exposed. A typical patrol lasted 12 hours, sometimes 24. We would leave the base at dawn, the twin diesels roaring, the boat planing over the brown water. At first, on the wide main rivers, you felt somewhat safe. The banks were hundreds of yards away. A sniper couldn't easily hit a moving target at that range. But then, the orders would come over the radio to turn into the canals. This was where the war changed. As soon as you entered a narrow waterway, the world closed in. The jungle canopy grew thick overhead, blocking out the sun. The water turned black and stagnant. The noise of the engines seemed amplified, echoing off the walls of mangroves. We were announcing our arrival to everyone for 5 miles. Every nerve ending was on fire. You stood at your gun station, knees bent to absorb the shock of the boat bouncing over the chop, knuckles white on the spade grips of the 50 cal. Your eyes scanned the banks constantly, not looking for a whole man. The VC were too smart for that. You were looking for anomalies. A patch of grass that was a slightly different shade of green, which might hide a bunker. A slight ripple in the water near the bank, which might be a command-detonated mine. A flock of birds suddenly taking flight ahead of you. We called it the 1,000-yard stare in the jungle. On the river, it was the bank stare. Your eyes burned from the strain. The psychological pressure was immense. You knew they were there. You could feel them watching you through the scope of a rifle or the sights of an RPG launcher. They could see you perfectly, a big, loud American boat cutting a wake through their backyard. But you couldn't see them. You were a duck in a shooting gallery, waiting for the carnival music to stop and the shooting to start. Sometimes the silence was the worst part. Mile after mile of empty river. Just the roar of the engines and the heat. The boredom would set in, and with it, complacency. That's when they would hit you. They called the heavy combat zones Ambush Alley. Everyone knew where they were, but we had to patrol them anyway to show the flag, to bait the enemy into a fight. I remember one patrol in the Quang Tinh province. It was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long, strange shadows across the water. The canal was narrow, maybe 50 feet wide. The nipa palm along the banks grew thick and tall, like a solid wall of green spikes. It was too quiet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My boat captain, a grizzled petty officer first class named Miller, sensed it too. He throttled back slightly, scanning the tree line with binoculars. "Keep your eyes peeled," he muttered over the intercom. "Something feels wrong." I was on the forward twin 50s. I chambered around, the heavy clack-clack of the bolts sliding home sounding oddly loud. We rounded a slight bend in the canal, and then the world disintegrated. It didn't start with gunfire. It started with a whoosh. The unmistakable, terrifying sound of a rocket-propelled grenade, an RPG-7 leaving its launcher. I caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. A gray streak of smoke shooting out from the dense mangroves on the left bank, not 75 feet away. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the warhead spinning towards us. It looked like a fiery Coke bottle. It missed the hull by inches, shrieking just over the canopy and exploding in the water on the other side of the boat. A massive geyser of mud and water erupted, soaking us instantly. The concussion knocked the breath out of me. Before I could even traverse my guns, the ambush opened up full force. Automatic weapons fire erupted from both banks simultaneously. AK-47s, RPD light machine guns. The green tracer rounds zipped past our heads like angry hornets. They smacked into the fiberglass hull, sounding like a hammer hitting a plastic bucket. Shards of white fiberglass flew everywhere. "Contact left! Contact right! Open fire!" Captain Miller screamed, slamming the throttles full forward. The engines roared in protest as the boat lunged ahead. I squeezed the butterfly triggers on the twin 50s. The guns roared to life. Thump, 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 thump. The noise on a PBR during a firefight is deafening. You don't hear individual shots. It's a continuous wall of sound that vibrates through your entire body. I walked the tracers into the jungle bank, where I had seen the RPG smoke. I couldn't see any individual targets, so I just chewed up the landscape. The heavy .50 caliber rounds tore through the palm fronds, shattering trees, turning the green wall into mulch. If anyone was behind that foliage, they were being turned into pink mist. The aft gunner was firing his .50, and the engine man was pumping grenades into the bank with the Mark 18 launcher. Thump, boom, thump, boom. The smell of cordite mixed with the diesel fumes, stinging my eyes. Another RPG screamed out of the brush. This one hit the water right next to the engine compartment. The blast lifted the stern of the 16,000-pound boat out of the water. Shrapnel punched through the engine covers. One of the diesels started sputtering, coughing black smoke. We were losing power. If we stopped here, in this kill zone, we were dead men. "Keep firing! Don't let up!" Miller yelled, wrestling with the wheel, trying to keep us in the center of the channel and keep the damaged engine running. The water around us was boiling with enemy fire. Bullets pinged off the gun shield in front of my face. This is the reality of a river ambush. There is no cover. You can't dig a foxhole in a fiberglass boat. You can't retreat. You have to fight your way through it. You have to overwhelming their fire with your own. Make them put their heads down so you can escape the kill box. We fired thousands of rounds in less than 2 minutes. The barrels of my machine guns were smoking hot, glowing dull red near the receivers. Finally, we cleared the bend. The intensity of the incoming fire slackened, then stopped as the VC realized we had punched through. We didn't stop running for another 2 miles. When we finally reached a wider section of the river, Miller throttled back. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unhook my safety strap. My ears were ringing. We checked the boat. The hull looked like Swiss cheese. There were dozens of holes in the fiberglass. The port engine was damaged, leaking oil. We checked each other. Anyone hit? Sound off? Miraculously, we were all okay. Scrapes, bruises from being thrown around, cuts from flying fiberglass, but no bullet holes. We had survived the gauntlet. This time, we patched the holes with duct tape to keep the water out, limped back to base on one good engine, rearmed, refueled, and got ready to go back out the next day. Because the river was still there, and so were they. While the PBRs were the fast cavalry of the rivers, there was another force out there. A force designed not to run, but to crush. We called it the Mobile Riverine Force, the Riverines. A shotgun marriage between the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army's 9th Infantry Division. Imagine a floating army base, huge barrack ships anchored in the middle of the wide Mekong River, looking like gray apartment buildings floating on the water. Inside, there was air conditioning, hot showers, and steak dinners. But just outside the hull, the war was waiting. The Navy sailors would ferry the Army infantry into battle on a different breed of boat. Not the fragile fiberglass PBRs, but the ATCs, armored troop carriers. We called them tangos. These things were beasts. 70 tons of steel. Ugly, flat-nosed, and slow. They looked like floating shoeboxes wrapped in bar armor. Steel cages designed to detonate RPG warheads before they hit the hull. They couldn't outrun a fight, so they were built to survive it. And they brought friends. The Monitors, heavily armored battleships of the river, mounting 40mm cannons and 105mm howitzers and turrets. And the most terrifying of all, the Zippos. Named after the cigarette lighter, these were flamethrower boats. I remember watching a Zippo in action during a bank clearing operation. It was a sight that stuck with you forever. The boat would creep up to a dense thicket of suspected bunkers. 2 nozzles on the bow would hiss, and then a stream of liquid napalm would arc out, hundreds of feet long. When it ignited, it looked like a dragon breathing. The jungle didn't just burn, it evaporated. The heat was so intense that the water in the river would steam. The oxygen was sucked out of the air for 100 yards. It was a brutal weapon for a brutal war. But for the infantry, the poor grunts of the 9th Division, the boats were just the taxi ride to hell. The ramp of the ATC would drop into the mud. Ramp down! Go! 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 The soldiers would charge out, waist deep in the muck, straight into the mangrove swamps. We Navy guys felt for them. We had our own dangers, mines, ambushes, rocket fire, but at least we fought with the deck under our feet and a breeze in our faces. The Army troops had to live in the mud. They called the Delta the world of wet. Leeches, foot rot, dysentery, and an enemy that could disappear underwater breathing through a hollow reed. We would stay close to the bank, providing fire support. The 20mm cannons on the Monitors would chew up the tree line, covering the soldiers as they advanced. I recall one operation in the U-Min Forest, the Forest of Darkness. It was a VC stronghold that hadn't been touched in years. We went in with a full column. Tangos, Monitors, Zippos. It looked like an invasion fleet. The canal was so narrow the boats were brushing against the trees. Then the ambush hit. It was a 360-degree kill zone. They hit us from both banks. Recoilless rifles, heavy machine guns. A rocket hit the boat in front of us. I saw the armor plate buckle. Smoke poured out of the well deck where the troops were huddled. The river turned into a cauldron of noise. But unlike the PBRs, the Riverines didn't run. They turned into the fire. The Monitors unleashed their howitzers at point-blank range. Boom! The concussion shook the trees. The Zippos unleashed the flame. Within minutes, the riverbanks were an inferno. The ambush was silenced not by speed, but by overwhelming, crushing firepower. We pulled the damaged boats out, medevaxed the wounded to the floating hospitals, and kept going. We were the iron fist in the water, slowly grinding the enemy down. If the days were violent, the nights were haunted. Night operations on the river were a completely different war. We didn't rely on firepower, we relied on stealth. We would drift. The boat captain would cut the engines miles upriver. We would float silently with the current, like a log, deep into enemy territory. Total silence. No talking, no smoking, no movement. You sat in the dark, listening. The delta at night is the loudest quiet place on Earth. The insects buzz with a constant electric hum. Monkeys scream. Fish jump. Every splash sounds like a swimmer with a satchel charge coming to blow up your boat. You become paranoid. Your mind starts to play tricks on you. You stare into the darkness until your eyes hurt. You see shapes that aren't there. Was that a shadow moving on the bank? Or just a tree branch swaying in the wind? We used the starlight scope, an early night vision device. It was big, clunky, and turned the world into a ghostly grainy green. Through the green haze, you watched the river traffic. The curfew was strict. Nothing moves on the river after dark. Anyone out there was considered enemy, but sometimes it was just a fisherman trying to feed his family. Sometimes it was a smuggler, and sometimes it was a sampan loaded with AK-47s and rockets. The decision to open fire was agonizing. You'd see a silhouette of a small boat paddling quietly. Do you light them up? If you're wrong, you've just killed civilians. If you wait too long to verify and they have an RPG, you're dead. The rules of engagement were a nightmare. Do not fire unless fired upon. But on the river, if you waited to be fired upon, you were usually already sinking. I remember one night near the Cambodian border. We were drifting. The starlight scope picked up 3 large sampans moving low in the water, heavily weighed down. They weren't fishing. We let them get close. 50 yards, 30 yards. Then the captain hit the searchlight. A beam of million candle power white light cut through the darkness like a physical blow. The sampans erupted. Men in black pajamas stood up and opened fire. Contact. We opened up with everything. The tracers at night looked like laser beams. Red from them, green from us, crisscrossing in the dark. The fight was short and vicious. The sampan splintered and sank. But then, we took fire from the bank. Heavy machine gun fire. We had drifted right into a base camp. We were pinned down. The tracers were hammering the boat. Get the sea wolves! Get the sea wolves! The sea wolves were our guardian angels. Navy UH-1 Huey gunships. Flown by the craziest, bravest pilots in Vietnam. They were the only ones who would fly at treetop level in the pitch black. Within minutes, we heard the whop, whop, whop of the rotors. Friendly boat, this is Seawolf 2-1. Keep your heads down. We're rolling in. The sky above us lit up. The Hueys unleashed their rockets and miniguns. Brrrr. The sound of a minigun at night is like canvas tearing. A solid stream of red fire poured from the sky into the jungle. The enemy fire stopped instantly. The sea wolves circled us, their searchlights sweeping the water, guiding us out of the kill zone. Seeing those helicopters overhead was the best feeling in the world. It meant you weren't alone in the dark. We survived the ambushes. We survived the rockets. But the river took its toll in other ways. The water itself was an enemy. It was toxic, a soup of agricultural runoff, chemicals and disease. We lived in it. We bathed in it. Jungle rot, immersion foot, was common. Your skin would turn white, wrinkle, and start to peel off in chunks. Fungal infections would eat away at your ears and between your fingers. And then there was Agent Orange. To stop the ambushes, the Air Force sprayed the riverbanks with defoliants. We watched the mangroves die. The leaves turned brown and fell off, leaving skeletal gray trunks. We didn't know then what the chemicals were doing to us. We just knew it made it harder for the VC to hide. We breathed the mist. We drank the water. Years later, many of us would pay the price for that protection in cancer wards back home. But the hardest toll was psychological. The riverine stare. It came from never being safe. On a base, you have a perimeter. In the ocean, you have distance. On the river, the enemy is always 20 yards away. You could be eating a ham sandwich at noon and be dead by 12:01. The stress burned men out. I saw 19-year-old kids with gray hair. I saw boat captains who shook so bad they couldn't hold a coffee cup. We lost a lot of good men. The Brown Water Navy suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the war. A PBR crew was a family. When you lost a crewman, you didn't just lose a soldier, you lost a brother. You stared at his empty bunk every night. You washed his blood off the deck plates the next morning so you could go back out on patrol. Eventually, my tour ended. I handed my flak jacket to the new guy, a kid fresh from training who looked terrified. I told him, "Keep your head down and never stop moving." I took a helicopter out of the Delta. As we climbed, I looked down at the river one last time. From up there, it looked peaceful. A silver ribbon winding through a green landscape. You couldn't see the mud. You couldn't see the bodies. You couldn't smell the cordite. But I knew what was down there. I left Vietnam, but the river never really left me. Even now, 50 years later, when I smell diesel fuel on a hot day, or hear the sound of a heavy boat engine, I'm back there. I'm back on the fiberglass boat. My hands are on the twin 50s. My eyes are scanning the tree line, waiting for the water to explode. The riverine force was unique in naval history. We were a makeshift navy, fighting a makeshift war. We didn't have the glory of the fighter pilots or the massive battles of the infantry divisions. We fought a lonely, dirty war in the mud, but we did our job. We controlled the rivers. We never backed down. And to the men who served on the PBRs, the swift boats, and the monitors, welcome home. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beneath the Metal. The story of the Brown Water Navy is often overlooked, but their courage was second to none. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Until next time.